What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we're updating Salamangreat with the release of the new ban list. This deck is looking really great for the upcoming format. Not only did it get back a couple of its own cards from the ban list, but it also got an indirect buff with the semi-limiting of Pot of Desires because it was one of the best pots that this deck could run since it was been running in pretty much ever since the release of the deck. So yeah, I feel like this deck is one of those decks that new players can really get into and learn a lot about how the game actually works. The deck is very fair, I would say, so I don't think it's more of the tier 1 category because what it does, it's really fair compared to the other decks, but what it can do is help you understand exactly how the game has been playing, how to conserve resources, how to push for a game, when not to push, when not to overextend. I really like this deck, and I feel like in the right hands, in the correct environment, this deck can really thrive, and it's not even at full power yet, so who knows, maybe in the future, the deck can get back all of its tools, and then it can once again dominate the tier 1 meta just like it did back in the day. So before we begin with the video, if you enjoyed, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So starting off the monsters, we have one copy of Gazelle. This is the only card left on the ban list. If this card goes to 3, and I guess if Pot of Desires goes to 3, which Pot of Desires most probably will in the next ban list, but yeah, this card is still up to debate whether Konami wants to put it at 3 or not, but if they do it, then yeah, this deck is going to become much better because this is still the best card in the main deck just because of how good it is. It's an extended from the hand, it's an Armageddon Knight, it's an amazing card, it's level 3 for Stalio. Yeah, being able to play multiple copies of this card would be great, but for now we have to play the one copy, so at least we can be thankful that we have 3 Circle to search this card, and along with Signed Mining means that this card is very easily accessible. Mirage Stalio can get it from the deck too, so getting access to it is not that big of a problem. The problem is when it gets banished, so you have to play without it, which the deck can still do, but sometimes it can be a little bit tricky. We have 3 copies of Spinny. This is basically the second normal summon that you want to be going for the most when you have access to another card, just because of being able to go into Mirage Stalio with this card means that you can get access to your Jaguar from the deck, you can get your Gazelle to get access to your traps. It's a really good card because being able to keep it back coming from the grave every single turn, as long as you keep using it for Exceed material instead of Link material, means that you will always have free fodder. And along with the next card, which is the 3 copies of Foxy, those 2 cards work in tandem. Usually the one you want to be normal summoning if you have is Foxy, so you can then use its effect to discard the Spinny to bring it back, because in order to bring back Foxy, all you need to have is your Sanctuary on the field. You don't even have to pop it, you just have to have a face-up spell card on the field, and then you will bring back your Spinny and you go into your rank 3. The sad thing about this card is that you cannot use its Pot of Duality effect on the same turn you use its Graveyard effect, but sometimes the first effect can be useful, but when you have Spinny, you most likely go for the effect to revive it from the graveyard to go for Stalio. If your card is not great, then you can potentially hope to excavate a card like a Spinny or a Gazelle to make your hand more playable, or if you want to have access to a trap, maybe it can get you to that too. So yeah, amazing card overall. We have 2 copies of Jaguar. Now, since the deck is playing Desires again, and it's not at 1, it's at 2, it's consistent, I would like to play more copies of Jaguar just because this card, in the grind game, it's more important than Gazelle. Gazelle is the card you want to see early that can get you to your setup plays, but then if it gets banished like summoned by a DD Crow, it doesn't matter too much. The card you want to have in the graveyard is Jaguar throughout the remainder of the duel, so you can keep getting back your resources with Sunlight Wolf and keep putting back your exotic monsters in the graveyard so you never run out. So yeah, having a second copy helps a lot when you have Desires in the deck. And the last Salamangreat monster in the main deck is 1 copy of Falco. This card can do some really cool plays. It can recycle Gazelle for the follow-up, so it can bring it back to your hand and special summon this card, or if it's go to the graveyard, you can maybe set a Circle to your back row, so your Sunlight Wolf doesn't have to recycle Circle and can recycle one of the trap cards to get more interruption, so you can also have a follow-up, or you can protect your Wolf with Circle from a monster effect. So yeah, this card does have some applications. It's not the best card in the world, but it's a decent one for the utility it provides. Now, the main normal summon of the deck is 3 copies of Flame Buffalo. Now, before, when we had 1 copy of Gazelle and 1 copy of Circle, Lady Debug was an okay card for the deck just because the deck needed this extra search power because it wasn't very consistent. Now, with 3 copies of Circle, I feel like Debug is kind of a win more card because there will be a lot of hands that you will already have a wave to see Gazelle, and Debug makes you very susceptible to a lot of hand traps that would otherwise not hurt you at all. For example, this deck doesn't care too much about Gamma unless you play Debug. This is why Buffalo, not only will it help you play around a lot more hand traps, but it will also help you dig for more hand traps yourself, or maybe trap cards to go into interruptions. And this deck sometimes, even if you don't have anything going for you, passing on a Bailings with maybe 1 or 2 hand traps with Aurora or Rage can sometimes be enough to get you your turn back, so you can potentially push for more damage during the follow-up. So yeah, this card digging through your deck, along with having multiple copies of Pot of Desires, means that you're going to see the cards you need more often than not. Now, for the hand traps of the deck, this deck is one of those decks that can play a lot of hand traps, because it doesn't have that big of an engine. It's a couple cards that you need to have in your hand, and being able to combo with one card means that this deck can play a lot of hand traps, which in a format like these, you have to if you're playing a mid-range deck or maybe a slower deck, just because you cannot keep up with the unfair stuff that the tier 1 decks can do. So we play 3 copies of Ash Blossom. Ash is more important in this particular deck than in any other deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just because you can recycle her with Sunlight Wolf's effect because she's a fire monster. So being able to have access to Ash Blossom every single turn means that this deck can snowball out of control, and if you just basically trade 1-for-1 effects every single turn with your opponent, eventually they'll run out of gas, while you'll still be able to get back cards from the graveyard. We play 3 copies of Ghost Ogre. Now, I know this card has fallen off a little bit, but the thing about this card is that it's really good against the adventure packets, and the adventure packets did not get hit one bit in the ban list. And even though people have started cutting it from Despia and they're playing pure, there are still decks that play the adventure packets, mainly the Therion plant decks, so this deck can struggle a lot against the adventure packets. Having 2 extra bodies on the field, and one being an Omni Negate and one that cannot be destroyed by battle, and that can also spin one of your cards every single turn with Draco back, this deck cannot really deal with that on top of everything else that the deck is going to throw its way, so you need to be able to get rid of with a Fateful Adventure immediately, so you don't have to deal with the adventure packets for the rest of the game. Otherwise, you're going to have a really hard time. So yeah, Ghost Ogre, even though in some matchups it's not going to be good, in this matchup where you're going to face the adventure stuff, it's really going to be useful. And in worst case scenario, it's a level 3 monster, so you can potentially summon it with another monster that you have on the field and go for Stalio, so it's not the worst card even if you cannot use it for this hand trap effect against certain matchups. We have 3 copies of Diddy Crow. This card is amazing against Branded in Red. Being able to basically make sure that your opponent doesn't get the second Mirror Jade means that you're going to have an easy ride against a deck like this, because the deck can play around 1 Banish, and it can play around Guardian Chimera's effect because of Bailings in the graveyard, but being able to use Mirror Jade's effect twice against a deck like this, you're not going to be able to play through something like that, because, for example, if your first card gets banished, then you have Assigned Mining to discard to get a Gazelle. That's the follow-up the deck can do, but if your other monster gets banished as well, which means you won't be able to bring back your Jaguars, your Spinnies, you're not going to be able to play around that, so being able to stop the Branded in Red from summoning back the Mirror Jade is very important, and because of that, we also play 3 copies of Ghost Bell, which is basically serves the same purpose, but this card does have some other interactions, because Diddy Crow in some other matchups can also be really dead, just like Ghost Ogre, but Ghost Bell is more generic and has more applications in other matchups as well, so she's a really good card to play. And I'm not playing any Veilers or Imperms, because I feel like these cards, especially Veiler, being with the Tri-Brigade Mercurier being on the format, means that Veiler is basically a card that's going to be dead sometimes against Despia, because if you don't Ash the Branded Fusion and you let them get a monster on the field, if you try to Veiler them and they have the Mercurier in their hand, that means that you're going to get negated. Imperm is fine, but it's still not the best card in the world, because you want to stop the Branded Fusion from activating with Ash Blossom, rather than negating the monster that's summoned with Branded Fusion, because then they will not be able to get the effects from the graveyard as well, or even send Fairy Tail Snow for other disruptions, because Fairy Tail Snow can be really hurtful against this deck. Book of Mooning cards in a deck that's based around Link monsters can be really devastating, so you don't really want to play around that as well. So this is why we play Ghost Ogre, Diddy Crow, and Ghost Bell in order to be able to play around cards like Branded in Red, and Ash Blossom, of course, it's the card that's gonna stop Branded Fusion to basically make sure that your opponent doesn't get to play at all if they have Branded Fusion and then don't have a follow-up with the Edge Imp packets. Now for the spells, we have fresh from the new list, we have 3 copies of Salamangreat Circle. This card is basically amazing. Being able to use this to get a search, and even if you draw multiple copies, it doesn't matter because it's a quick play, so you can set it to basically protect your back row from a card like Cosmic Cyclone, because they won't know which one is the trap card and which one is Circle, and then you can use this during your opponent's turn because it's a quick play to either get another Surge or protect your Sunlight Wolf from monster effects, which can be really useful in some matchups as well, because you need to keep a monster on the field in order to be able to activate your trap card, so if your opponent gets rid of it somehow before they commit to the hard plays, then that means that you will not be able to Roar and Raise our important cards, so this is why this card is really good, and being at 3 feels so good, and the deck is consistent enough now that you can play Bufferlo and not really care about debug anymore, because I know that debug was very tempting, being able to search Gazelle, but I assure you that debug now, especially now, is going to lose you more games than is going to win you games. We play 1 copy of Sanctuary. You always want to see this card before you activate Desires, so basically activating Desires before you search this card means that you will not have anything as a Cybers monster in your hand to go for Bailings, because if you do, the correct play is always to go for Bailings, search this card, and then activate Desires, because the deck can play without Gazelle, but playing without Sanctuary can be really hard sometimes. Those Reincarnation Link summons can really help you access to more powerful effects like the effect of Rage, or being able to activate the effect of your Hit Leo twice, and then basically spin your opponent's back row, weaken their monsters, and attack over them. We play one copy of Will of the Salamangreat. This card can be debated on whether it's a 1-off or a 2-off. I feel like it's a 2-off sometimes, but depends on the hand. And the thing is, this card was better when Nibiru was a thing, but now Nibiru is such a bad hand trap that you will definitely not see it, at least not in the main deck. People might be siding Nibiru for some combo matchups, but I don't feel like anyone is playing Nibiru in the main deck right now, so you don't really need the revival effect, because the thing about this card, it was good when you got Nibiru'd, and then you would bring back a Link monster, so you would have a Link monster to at least activate a card like Roar. So this is why revival effects like Will of the Salamangreat were better when Nibiru was very, very relevant, but now without Nibiru being so popular, I feel like playing one Will of the Salamangreat, you can get away with it, so it's not like you need to play more than one. We play 3 copies of Cyanide Mining, again searching you all your combos. This card can even help you play around Mirror Jade, because the thing is, Will of the Salamangreat is a card that can get you to another monster of the field, but you don't really need it, because Gazelle is a card that can get itself on the field if you send a Salamangreat to the graveyard. So this is why Cyanide Mining is such a powerful card, because even if your normal summon gets banished by Mirror Jade, if you have a Salamangreat in your hand with Cyanide Mining, you still have a play, as long as you can stop their Braden in red so they don't get back the second Mirror Jade. So this is why this card is so good in combination with a card like Ghostwheel or Didicrop. We play 2 copies of Desires. Hopefully we will be playing 3 in the next ban list, and I feel like this is pretty much guaranteed. I doubt Konami would keep Desires at 2. It would make no sense, so we will have more firepower, more draw search, and in the next ban list, and hopefully maybe with more Gazelles. But again, it feels great having this card at 2, because at 2 it's okay, you're going to see it sometimes, but when it was at 1, it was a card you hardly ever saw. It was an unsearchable one of that. If you saw, then it was really powerful, but it hardly ever happened, so having it at 2 is a lot better. And I know that there are players who would still play 2 instead of 3, even if it goes to 3, which I can see the debate of not playing 3 Desires, but I feel like it's such a powerful card that you need to play 3 when you can play 3 again. And the last spell is 1 copy of Call by the Grave, not just to stop hand traps. If people say that you need to play Call by the Grave in order to stop hand traps, that's half true. Yes, it can do that, but this card, even in a format like this, where there are a lot of Despia decks that they play 0 hand traps at all, it's still a powerful card to have in the main deck. It's not just because it can stop hand traps, it's because of how good a card and effect it has altogether, and this is why people argue that this card should be banned. And yes, sometimes I feel like this card is too unfair, so yeah, it's not just for the hand traps. Crossout Designator, it's just for the hand traps, which is why it's not a popular card, because it's just for hand traps. Called by the Grave is a card that can stop hand traps on top of having a lot of useful effects that you can use against a lot of other decks, being able to banish and negate cards from the graveyard, because the graveyard is a second hand these days. So yeah, this is why Called by the Grave is such a powerful card. For the trap cards, we have 2 copies of Salamangreat Roar. There are a lot of players who play 1 of each. I play 2 of each, because with Desires, you're going to banish them sometimes, and you need access to these trap cards in order to control the tempo of the game, because without them, you don't really have any inherent interruptions. So this is why these cards, I feel like with Desires back at 2 and at 3 during the next list, you need to play more than 1 copy of each. So we play 2 Roar, which is the Infernity Barrier of the deck that can also set itself when you Reincarnation Link, and we have 2 copies of Salamangreat Rage, which basically pops cards on the field equal to the link rated of a reincarnated Link monster. But even if you don't have one on the field, you can send a Salamangreat card from your hand or field to the grave to target 1 card on the field and destroy it, which is better than nothing sometimes if your opponent doesn't allow you, for example, to add your Salamangreat Sanctuary in the hand for some reason. For the extra deck, we have 3 copies of Balinks. The Salamangreat lineup, I feel like, is pretty standard in the extra deck, especially now, because the deck doesn't have really much space to do a lot of other stuff. So yeah, 3 Balinks, pretty standard, being able to protect your cards, especially now, in a format where Guardian Chimera is one of the most oppressive monsters in the game because of Despia being so popular. This card can save you so many times against this card, which is not even funny. We play 3 copies of Sunlight Wolf. This is the main monster you want to be ending on during the early game. It's a card that's going to get you back your fire monsters, it's going to get you back your spells and traps. It's a monster that's a link 2, so you can get 2 pops with Rage, which is much better than having just a Balinks on the field. Yeah, this card is amazing. We play 2 copies of Heatleo. This card is mainly for Eldritch. I don't think you're going to be using this card too much against other matchups, just because the effect to basically decrease the attack of a monster right now is not super relevant. It used to be when people were playing Fusion of Fire and they were trying to OTK with Violet Chimera, but now that we have access code, it doesn't really make sense to play a card like this in the deck, because you don't need it. We have other cards to be able to seal out the games. But yeah, against Eldritch, this card can be really good, because if your opponent doesn't have skill drain, you can play around cards like Torrential, you can play around cards like Conquistador, Dogmatica Punishment. This is why Balinks is so good. So basically, spinning their back row back into the deck means that they will not be able to float during the end phase. So yeah, this card against control matchups, it's really good, but there will be matchups where you won't be summoning this card at all. For more generic Link monsters, we play 1 copy of Splash Mage. This card is here to basically give you a Link climb so you can get more powerful monsters on the field. We have 1 copy of Update Jammer. This card makes your access code attack twice, which is 10,600 damage. You can destroy your opponent's its entire life point bar. We play 1 copy of Transcode Talker. Being able to revive your update jammer means that you can get an easy access to access code, and then you're going to use update jammer's effect to basically make your access code attack twice and not your transcode attack twice. And speaking of which, we have the 1 copy of access code, which this card gave the deck what it really required. I mean, the deck felt like in the past that it could not seal out games very consistently, which is why people play Fusion of Fire, but ever since access code came out, this deck actually had the pressure of being able to destroy you very, very quickly. So this is why when we get all the combination of the cards that we get back from the ban list with the cards that we have received throughout the past, because access code was not a card that the deck had access to during its prime. So yeah, when Gazelle gets back to 3, this deck will be even more powerful than when it was tier 1, and in the correct format, having access to all those tools can basically make this deck really, really good. And for the Xyz monsters, we have 2 copies of Stalio. You don't want to play 3. The thing is, the card was always a 2-off, even when it was at 3 back in the day before it got banned, and now this card basically gives you the option to not have to recycle it with Jaguar every single time. And this card, its main purpose during the late game is mainly to bounce. During the early game, it gives you access to your plays, but having this second copy in the extra deck means that you have some more pressure going second, just because the effect to bounce when it's linked away for a Salamangreat monster is really powerful, so you don't need to underestimate an effect like this, even though it has an emergency teleport effect on top of it. So yeah, the second copy means that you don't have to put it back with Jaguar, so you can put copies of Sunlight Wolves, which are the more important cards throughout the grind game. And we play 1 copy of Baguska. You can play Parallel Exceed in the deck as well, but I still feel like Parallel Exceed is a card that makes your good hands better and your bad hands worse. And I feel like in a deck like this, you don't really need to play like that, just because it has tools to basically do what it needs without over risky cards like that, because Parallel Exceed can break you a lot of the time. So having access to Baguska more easily, I don't feel like it's worth the risk of playing Parallel Exceed. And how you summon this is with Jaguar and Salamangreat Falco, which is not as difficult as it seems, just because you have so many ways to summon the monsters from the deck and dump them to the graveyard. So yeah, this card is an auto win against Branded Despia because they play an extra deck of 15 fusion monsters, so there's nothing in the deck, at least not in the archetype, that can basically deal with this card. Then they will have to hard draw a card like Forbidden Droplet in order to be able to play under Baguska. So yeah, that's the deck, guys. Salamangreat is just a fantastic deck, I feel like. The way this deck was created, I feel like it's one of the best deck designs that we've seen in a long time. So yeah, I just highly recommend you try this deck out if you've never played it. It's a really fun deck. It's going to teach you fundamentals of the game that you need to incorporate in pretty much any other deck you play, and it does it so well. It's not a tier 1 deck, at least not yet, but it's a really budget deck, if you exclude access code, of course, but we don't talk about that here. So yeah, basically you can pick this up deck for really cheap. It's a really good deck. It can have some success, at least. I don't feel like it's the correct format right now, but in the future, especially if we get more copies of Gazelle, it can become much, much better. So be on the lookout for this deck, and you're going to see it, at least in the beginning of the format, quite a bit, just because of how popular this deck used to be. So yes, people are going to try it every time it gets cards back from the ban list. So for the first few weeks of the format, you're going to see it quite a lot, both online and in real life tournaments. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.